Hello, and welcome to the C-Suite Chronicles podcast. We're bringing you the top voices in tech leadership. Immigration policy in the U.S. is outdated. The last time the laws were updated was in 1990. Needless to say, it's time for a major overhaul. Why does this matter? America's immigration policies are creating a massive brain drain for U.S. employers, particularly in tech. We already know there isn't enough talent being produced domestically to fill open positions for highly skilled jobs. But current immigration policy makes it challenging for employers to hire foreign nationals. As a result, they're leaving the US and going to other countries like Canada and Australia that welcome immigrants and make it easy for them to get jobs there. Without reform, America's economy and ability to hire international talent will continue to suffer. Now, I want to be clear here. We're talking about policies that allow for foreign nationals to work in the US. These are things like H-1B visas and some of the other visas that currently exist for this purpose. I had a fascinating conversation with Jennifer Grundy-Young and Tahmina Watson about US immigration policy and its implications for tech employers. Jennifer is the CEO of the Technology Councils of North America, or TECNA. She's a frequent speaker on U.S. immigration policy issues and a passionate advocate for reform. Tahmina is the founder of Seattle-based Watson Immigration Law, and her practice focuses primarily on business immigration, especially startup and investment immigration matters. She's also a best-selling author and host of the Tahmina Talks Immigration podcast. In short, when it comes to immigration reform in the U.S., we have a lot of work to do. But as Jennifer said during our interview, this is a workforce issue, not an immigration issue. The ability to attract and retain diverse talent, including foreign nationals, is an issue that could make or break your company's very survival in the coming years. So I encourage you to listen to this episode, and if you want to make a difference, make your voice heard on immigration reform. I'm Robin Kurtek, and this is the C-Suite Chronicles. Jennifer, Tahmina, thank you both so much for being on the show today. It's really a pleasure to have you both. Before we jump into the topic today, I wondered if you could just take a brief moment, each of you, to introduce yourselves and give our listeners a little bit of information about your background.
Jennifer Young. I am the CEO of the Technology Councils of North America. We are a membership organization and represent 60 plus members, regional technology councils that represent the innovation economy. So tech companies, innovators across North America, so Canada and the United States. I came to TECNA in January of 2021, having a long time with the Regional Tech Council in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Technology Council. And this particular issue was one that really dating back to 2007, when I started there, I was hearing from our member companies that they were having a huge amount of trouble attracting and retaining talent, highly skilled talent. So this issue has been front and center for a long time.
Thank you so much for having me. I am an immigration attorney in Seattle, Washington. My law firm is Watson Immigration Law. I started practicing in 2006, but I started my own law firm in 2009. And if you were in the technology industry during that time, you'll remember that we had a very similar situation going on at that time, with a lot of layoffs from different, companies in Seattle and elsewhere. And my practice is primarily business immigration, but what that period did, it really thrusted me into the startup world of why don't we have a visa for startup founders and immigration reform. So my practice is primarily helping startups, small businesses, medium businesses with their visa needs for their employees, but also helping startups, entrepreneurs, investors with expanding into the US market and what kind of visas they need. And in the process, I have become a very vocal advocate for change with columns and op-eds and books and so forth. And in fact, on July 4th, my next book will come out called A Visa Guide for Startup Founders and Entrepreneurs. So I'm very excited about that. So I'm very excited to be here to talk about all the things that, this audience really needs to know.
less than favorable immigration policy in the US is contributing to the shortage of skilled workers, and particularly in the tech industry. And I wanted to start out by talking about how current US immigration policy, what it looks like, and how that impacts the tech industry's ability to recruit foreign nationals. I just read recently that Indian nationals on an H-1B visa have to wait an average of 90 years to get their employment-based permanent residence, or what's commonly known as PR. And in contrast, when you look at Canada, those employment-related programs result in PR in under 2 years. That's a really big disparity. And it appears that US companies might be missing key opportunities to recruit and retain international talent due to our current immigration policies. And what is your take on that? And would you agree that the US is undermining its ability to tap into international talent and that policy change is needed?
1990 is when we had the laws that we work with right now. So if you think about 1990 and 2023, how much has the world changed in this period? The laws have not changed to keep up. And that's one of our biggest problems. The visa categories that we have were designed for that era. The visa categories do not match with what we need in this moment either. And we have a Congress that doesn't really want to update the laws in the way we need it. So we are in challenging situations, all the time. But I would say in the last 6 months, it has become even more apparent how challenging this is because of all the layoffs that have happened. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is the visas that we have are used in every industry. They're industry agnostic, for the medical industry, legal community, technology, healthcare, you name it. Every industry will use the same visas that we have. And, there are startups and tech companies in all of these industries as well. The challenge that we have is that the education system in this country is not producing the workforce that we need. And that is becoming, giving us a disadvantage over, you just mentioned Canada, it's a disadvantage over other countries. Australia just did an overhaul of what their laws are because everybody's looking for talent. And a post-COVID world is very different to how it was pre-COVID, and I'm sure Jen has some thoughts about that. So our policies need to be updated, and they need to be updated right now. While I've talked about some industries where we have high-skilled professions, if you think about some of the industries that don't necessarily need the high skills, but we need skills for nursing homes, restaurants, hotels, construction industry, all the consumer companies that are tending towards the American consumer, those companies do not have enough workers. So no matter which industry you look at, our immigration policies are not keeping up.
Yes, I'll maybe take it from the actual policy angle of this, but as many as 25 other countries have updated their immigration policies many times since our last update in 1990. And the view of immigration policy is quite different than it is in the United States. And as Tahmina mentioned, it's not keeping up with our economics that are actually happening in the United States, where their immigration policies are based on what the economic need is in their country. So they view it completely different. They view this as a tool to help fuel their economy. These people are fueling their economy. They're building their economy. They're the best and the brightest in the world, or their skills that they need that they're not necessarily being met within the production of educational talent in their own countries. So they're building an entire system, immigration policy system around what their country needs, and it's not nimble. The United States policy isn't nimble at all. In fact, it moves at a snail's pace, and so we get stuck flat-footed a lot, and we are losing in droves talent, and we're leaving them on the table. We're educating them in the United States too. Our U.S. education system is educating buckets of foreign nationals, and we're not keeping them here. We're sending them home with their American degrees to their countries or to other countries that are welcoming them with open arms because they want them. And so it's really critically important that the United States chooses to look at this in a very different way. Instead of it being, the highly polarized issue that it currently is, this is a workforce problem. This is not an immigration problem. We have a workforce problem in this country, and the view of it needs to change pretty quickly, or we're going to continue to lose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's those observations are absolutely fascinating. Well, let's talk specifics. We started out with Canada. And how is Canada using U.S. immigration policy to its advantage to compete in tech and build its economy? Are there any data that demonstrate what the actual losses to the U.S.? For example, Canada hires X tech immigrants per year compared to the U.S. And maybe it's not a Canada versus U.S. thing, and I don't mean to set it up that way, but just curious your thoughts there, because that is a country that seems to really be doing well and progressively recruiting and retaining talent, whereas obviously as we've mentioned, the U.S. is lagging behind.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this. For starters, as I'd mentioned, the very first thing I said was how countries view immigration. For starters, Canada views immigration very positively. They want people to come to Canada. They see multinationalism as a benefit. They see the diversity as a power play for their companies, for their entire economy. And so they view it completely different. They one of the data points that I could find is that the US lost 45,000 graduates, US graduates that were foreign nationals here on education visas from 2017 to 2021 directly to Canada. And those most likely, maybe couldn't find a sponsor for their H-1B in the United States and found one in Canada. But the Canadian system is completely different. It's set up completely differently, and they took advantage of it in the mid 20 teens. They have an entire system set up around their economy, as I mentioned, but they do something where a Canadian company or any company needs to benefit or needs to show benefit to the regional economy as well. So when they want to bring a foreign national in, they have to put in place a labor markets benefit plan. So they have to show how they're going to also, by pulling immigrants in to help with their current, economic state or their company needs, they have to show how they're giving back to Canada as well, whether that is through other jobs that they're going to be putting into, other hires, or trainings that they're going to be putting into place in the same region where they're going to be hiring. And so it's kind of the 1-2 punch. They're not, the argument in the United States often is, well, they're taking American jobs. No, they're not. But Canada doubles down on that and says, here, they're not taking Canadian jobs, they're creating more Canadian jobs, which is actually the case in the United States as well. But Canada really has capitalized on that. And, Canada is able to turn around, visas as short as 2 weeks to get people in place and working. And they've had almost 100% application approval rate. They're about 97%, which is incredible. So they've got highly skilled talent coming in droves, and they've done it based off of what their economic needs are.
I see it from a practitioner's point of view. I'm a practitioner. I'm dealing with people on a very daily basis, and suddenly they don't have a path to stay here. And I'm going to address that in a second, but I want to tell you how smart Canada is. There was a time a few years ago where the U.S. Immigration Service said, we are not going to fast premium process any case. You can pay the government extra money and they will fast track your case within 2 weeks. We're going to stop this for an uncertain period. And it turned out to be 6 months or more. At this point, I can't remember. But the moment we had that announcement, Canada the next day said, you know what, we're going to speed up our applications. And that's where 2 weeks came from, and it's continued. They have consistently processed cases that fast. They look at what our shortcomings are, and they immediately find a solution to do it better. Our startup visa, I have been a diehard startup visa proponent since this issue was even like in people's breaths. It hadn't even got on paper yet. And the first bill that came down in Congress in 2010 was the bill that Canada took from us, and they amended it, edited it, they made it their own, and it's implemented. It took a few years for it to ramp up, but if you look at it now, it is the premier destination for startups around the world. If you look at India, where there are many unicorns at this point, over the COVID period, Tiger Global and other US funds had created funds abroad to create these unicorns. the startup scene and the technology growth that's happening, they want to be in the US. But if they can't be in the US, at least they can be next door in the same time zone with the same, investors who are opening funds there too. So Canada's very smart in using our shortcomings to their advantage. And I see that from a practice perspective. I do want to touch on a couple of things on the H-1B problem. The H-1B, all of our visa categories that we have, and I mentioned they're from 1990, the H-1B is the most popular one. You need a degree to be able to do the job in question, and there are only 85,000 visas given out each year. Last year, the government got almost 500,000. This year, the government got almost 800,000. That means, though, the pipeline of students who are coming out from education are not going to be selected. And they haven't been. I filed 20 to 25 cases, not a single one got selected. And a lot of them had master's degrees, which normally has a bit of an advantage. So most lawyers across the board reported that they had less than 10% of selection from their cases. Going forward, that is not good for America. There's a complete sort of cycle of economic interests in all of this. Our schools rely on foreign students to come and, get educated. It keeps our schools alive. And those are the workforce that we hope will be, helping our businesses. But what I anticipate is that students may not want to come here. If you were to look at data, student populations are already down, and it's not going to get any better. So reform is needed on so many different levels, but the word immigration immediately polarizes people. So I would love people to quote Jen left and right. It's a workforce problem. It is not an immigration problem.
For sure. I love that. And I think that's a really smart way to look at it. You mentioned education and the issues there. What other ways is the U.S. causing its economy harm by not updating its immigration policies?
You mentioned the green card backlog for Indian nationals. It's as Indian nationals, Chinese nationals, people from Philippines, Mexico, and a couple of other countries. Tip of my tongue. If you think of the American green card system as a dartboard, bullseye is the first category, employment-based. There's not a lot of waiting time for that. It's how long does it take to get to your file. But as you get on the outer skirts of that dartboard, the waiting time gets longer and longer. EB1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it gets divided, if you like, as a pizza, into India, China, Philippines, and then all countries as a slice. And then you have to figure out which part of this dartboard are you in, which segment. And so the India EB2, EB3, they're almost not moving. But the all countries, if you're from Norway or UK or Canada, you don't have a lot of waiting time. But right now we're in a moment where that could have a waiting time. The trouble is that we have a lot of people who have already been in the waiting game, so to speak. And if you just think of what's happening in the last 6 months, hundreds of thousands of people have been laid off. A large portion of them are immigrants who have been in that waiting time, waiting for their green card. These are talented people who have learned from our companies, our technology, our all of the skills that we have given them. They have lost their opportunity for their green cards. They have lost 2 incomes. Often they have 2 incomes because of the green card pathway. And now they're sort of thinking, well, I might as well just leave. So what you have is these people who have sometimes trade secrets, I guess, because they're learning the technology from our companies. Who will not snap them up? Canadian companies will snap them up. Australian companies will snap them up. UK companies will snap them up because they have been working at the headquarters of these global companies. The loss is ours. And I come back to Jen's quote. It's a workforce problem, not an immigration problem.
Tahmina nailed it. It really is. And if you look at, the backlogs and the per country caps going into some of these countries, if you look at Canada's largest, the country where they get the largest immigrants, it's India. And it's buckets by thousands are coming from India. And oftentimes, and I say this a lot, but it's true. Oftentimes when you have an Indian immigrant coming, They're a 2-for-1. If you have one come in for an H-1B that is a master's degree or a PhD, their partner or spouse is typically also a master's or PhD level person. So you get 2-for-1, and it's a mind-boggling to me that the United States hasn't figured this out yet. And maybe they have, they just don't care. But Canada sure has, and they're just taking them in droves. And that's, a lot of the companies have figured this out too. While we've laid off a lot in the United States, a lot of them have opened, shop in Vancouver, Toronto, multiple different places in Canada. And so when they find they can't hire them in the United States, they'll just hire them in Canada for the same company. And they're doing that over and over again. And we're seeing that, a lot of American companies now have chosen to go to Canada to just say, well, if we can't do it here, we'll do it there. And you're in the same time zone. And boy, does this work well. And they get the job done quickly. And you'll see the per country caps, they're filling them there. And so the backlog doesn't exist, and they're able to go there. And it's unfortunate that, we're losing a lot of the highly skilled, as Tahmina said. It's really unfortunate that we're losing them. But I'm glad they're able to find employment somewhere where they're welcomed.
I wanted to switch gears for a minute and talk a little bit about immigration fraud. Tahmina, you mentioned before that the H-1B visa in particular is, there's about 85,000 of those that are allowed per year. And then I was reading that with some other exemptions, there's sort of approximately 130,000 international workers that can receive H-1B visas, which is obviously not enough to fill this, 1 million or so open unfilled jobs in the US, meaning, that's primarily in tech. I think the number that we often cite is around 900,000. And I think that was in 2021. There were that many jobs open. It seems to be that some staffing firms are even trying to create multiple H-1 visas to get around these immigration rules, or they're trying to use the H-1B to outsource jobs to cheaper talent overseas. And some reports indicate that as much as 30% of the 130,000 H-1B visas are consumed by staffing firms that are using this approach, which means there's less visas available for everyone, and in particular our focus to tech employers. Can we talk a little bit about the ways that policy is being abused, and if there are ways, the ways that tech companies can support reform on that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is tech companies do need to be vocal. I think all corporate businesses need to be advocates at this point. Sitting on the sidelines is not an option anymore. But coming to the actual fraud, as a practitioner, I can tell you what I saw happening. So there was a new system that was created, I want to say maybe 3 years ago, where instead of putting the entire application together, where you put all of the forms, the fees together, and many lawyers will attest to the fact that they stayed up weeks and nights, months, putting these applications together, the file, so that your case could be selected. That was a lot of work, and it was a lot of money for the employers to put forward, hoping that they'd be selected. Thousands. Each application would cost you $460 plus $500 plus $1,500 if you have more than 26 employees, and or $750 if you have less. So add those up, and $2,500 if you want to get a speedy answer. So you're looking at close to $5,000. What happened during the previous administration is that they said, we're not going to take all of these big full applications with these costs anymore. We're going to have you put your name in with your employee's name for $10 only. Was the first year? Yeah, it was $10. And what happened in the first year, the numbers increased because suddenly $10, no skin off my nose, why not do it? And so what happened is that it became more efficient and cost effective for these employer institutions to be able to put these applications forward. But the numbers of the 85,000 didn't change. So to increase their chances of being selected, the reports are, luckily I don't know any of these employers, reports are that there've been collusion, and to make sure that there is more chance of being selected, the one employee has been put in the lottery multiple times. Now, this was predicted at the time the new policy came in, like, how are you going to prevent fraud? And there wasn't a lot of discussion of how we were going to solve that. But what we saw last year is that there were 500,000. Suddenly it went from, 300,000, which had happened in the past. 500,000 was an indicator that fraud was in play. And so when this year, 2023, February, came along, the Immigration Service said, we are going to actually take action against those who will commit fraud. But I don't think many of these organizations necessarily believed it. And so the question becomes, what do you do now? With almost 800,000 applications filed, you have to take action. Luckily, I'm not in that position to make those decisions. I can just complain and hope somebody will take care of it. But I think non-action is not an option. I think the administration has to do something to prevent fraud, because it is ultimately hurting our economy. And one of the things that Jen had mentioned earlier is there is a multiplier effect to these H-1Bs. If people are complaining about they're taking our jobs, first of all, how, where? We don't have enough workers. But one H-1B worker actually creates in total maybe 5 to 7 new jobs, because that person needs a doctor and an accountant, and then those people need cleaners or what have you, non-skilled position. That's how the multiplier effect happens. So it's a good thing for this country, but if the program cannot be used properly, then we have major problems with much bigger implications.
So to me, the other end of that coin, which I'm sure as a practitioner you saw all the time, was that the American system is already based on suspecting fraud, sadly, where there were 30% that may be fraudulent, but the other 70% is not. And the process is slowed down because of the bad actors, because the immigration, authorities assume that every application is fraudulent. And so they run through multiple checks and multiple this, and it takes forever to get things processed. That's one of the reasons it takes forever to get everything processed. But they come in suspect that everything is fraudulent, and it slows things down so much. And they're not. The majority of them are not, while there is a chunk that is, or are multiple applications for the same H-1B. It's a sad state. And I've said it 100 times, the entire system needs an overhaul, but at this point, it would be like overhauling the IRS. I don't even know where to begin on trying to do that. But it's what happens when you don't update the system for 30 plus years.
And I have, some amazing startup companies. They've been around for several years, and they're really scaling, and they're creating some amazing products, but you need the skills. And one company is that doing some amazing research and development on some innovative products. They didn't get a single person selected, but these people have the talent that they need. So what do you do? And the overall comes to this point that we have no other visa that is suitable, which is why I'm writing this book, to be honest. I actually been writing it since January 2022, but life happened. But then the layoffs happened. And I've been doing a lot of workshops with people who are laid off that, who want to have their startups, but don't necessarily know how to begin. It's, what are the alternative visa categories? The trouble is we don't have a lot. Mm-hmm. That's why we need reform of the entire system.
Are there ways that you mentioned tech leaders getting vocal, employers getting vocal? Are there ways that folks can help? They can lean in and try to affect some change?
Absolutely. And that's something that TECNA does a lot of. We try to educate policymakers. We try to give them real world perspectives. They don't want to hear from people like me or other individuals that represent the masses. They want to hear from the companies on the ground who need these people, or who have really amazing immigrants that have come to the United States and have started jobs started companies and created jobs and are really high contributors to the economy. So they can get involved with organizations like TECNA, their local trade association, WTIA, because those types of entities are advocating and educating the policymakers about what on the ground companies look like, not just the talking heads in Washington and not just constituents who may or may not be fully educated about what's happening. These companies are their constituents too, and they can explain to them how important one immigrant might be to their entire company moving forward. A lot of small companies only need one or two, and they end up creating 14, 15 jobs because they were able to hire two key people that they cannot find in the United States. And so they're able to tell that story. And so we encourage them to reach out to their trade associations and to the WTIA and organizations like that, because they can help them tell that story.
I concur. And I think one of the things that I hear from my smaller to medium companies, or even those that are scaling up, they're hesitant to speak up. And the way somebody explained it to me is they said, well, immigration is just one component, but I have issues entangled in SEC laws or contracts law or different types of agencies. I can't get, entangled in these debates and have my company's name out there. And therefore, I'm not going to speak. One of my clients that never got a denial in the entire decade that I'd been helping them until the previous administration. That's when this client explained to me saying, no, I cannot speak up because of ABC. And it just was a light bulb that went off in my mind that that's why they cannot speak. But as we move forward, these past few years, not speaking is actually harming your company at this point. You cannot, it's almost like the left hand must speak to the right hand. Otherwise, the head cannot stay in place, and I think it's vitally important now, before the 2024 election, to put things in place so that we have a framework that we can work with and have things that can sustain no matter what administration gets in position in 2024. So I think that it's very, very important for companies to speak. I do want to take a moment to talk about just something and while I have mentioned many times there is no startup visa, we do have something from the Obama era that is called the International Entrepreneur Parole. It is our version of a startup visa. So anybody who's listening, who's like, okay, yes, I do have a startup and I do want to come into the US and I do have funds that have been, given to me and raised by VCs or angels, they could take advantage of it to come to the US. It is not a visa, it's a program, parole, permission to be here, but it is something that could benefit our country in so many different ways. So I didn't want to forget mentioning that to you.
No, that's great. And I'm glad that you brought that up. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I'm just going to go back to saying what I said before. This is not an immigration problem. It is a workforce problem. And the more that we're able to even just change the semantics, change the conversation around it so that we're conveying that to policymakers, that we are in a dire situation at this point. We're dire now. As time goes on, these types of jobs are needed more and more and more and more. And it's only going to get worse. And by the time, the way Congress typically works, by the time they decide to do something because they deem it a dire situation, it will be too late at that point. It won't be reversible. The ship will have sailed. And so we don't want to lose these people. We don't want to lose the companies that are starting here. We want them to stay here. It is the place to start a company. It is the place to make, the American dream happen. And that's how it happens. We started this way. We are a melting pot. We need to continue to be one. And we have mechanisms in place to do it. They just need to be updated to reflect on our economic needs, which is how they all started in the first place.
And I will piggyback on that to say that the everyday person who's listening to this, whichever industry they may be in, is to just think about your life. Look around. If you have a cell phone, look at it. Who's maintaining the hardware, the software, the network? If we didn't have skilled immigrants, maintaining a lot of these, our daily lives wouldn't actually be functioning in the same way. And I think COVID was a demonstration of how immigrants did keep up, hold our, lives together, whether it was Zoom or Moderna's, vaccine that saved our lives, the doctors who actually protected us, the people in the grocery stores, the apples, the shiny apples that continue to be on the shelves. Who picked those? Just look at your lives around you and think about each item and think about how it got there to you, how it's been maintained. The everyday person is the voter. And Jen mentioned, she was at an elected office, she was getting calls about immigration. Let's have those calls to say we want immigration reform. Not that we don't want immigration, we want reform. We want our ag tech, our health tech, our fintech, whatever the industry is, we want it to grow, because whatever grows here, it grows around the world.
It's everywhere.
And so we're not just us, we are the world, but it starts here.
That's well said. I think that's so important. Well, thank you both so much. This has been an extremely insightful conversation, and I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of it. So thank you both for your time today.
Thank you,
Robin.
Sweeping immigration reform won't happen on its own. It needs broad support from business leaders, policymakers, and industry to move the needle. WTIA offers a community of members who are deeply passionate and committed to fostering a robust, equity-centered technology sector that empowers thriving communities. And best of all, membership is free for tech companies. Learn more about how you can join our community and make an impact on immigration reform and other critical issues facing the tech industry at washingtontechnology.org/membership/#join-today. Again, that's washingtontechnology.org/membership/#join-today. If you liked what you heard on today's podcast, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and please share this content with your peers on your social media channels and in other ways that it'll reach as many people as possible. Our goal is to help more founders achieve success more quickly, and the best way to do that is by sharing our collective knowledge. A rising tide lifts all boats, and the more the WTIA tech community can help and support one another, the better.